a senior economist here at the Boston Fed in the research department, and I'm really excited about today's event because actually a lot of the research that I do is on monetary policy and thinking about the objectives of central banks and how we should achieve those objectives. So it's very interesting to hear from the community what you all think about these issues. So first, I'd like to just very briefly introduce our panelists, and then I'll give them some time to talk a little bit more about their backgrounds and experiences. So first, here on my left, we have Joanne Chang, who's the owner of Flower Bakery and Myers and Chang Restaurant. Then we have Michael Tomasi, who's the president and CEO of AccuRounds. Next to him, we have Mark Ehrlich, who's a Wertheim Fellow currently at the Harvard Law School. And lastly, we have Peter Foreman, who's president and CEO of the South Shore Chamber of Commerce. So I'm going to turn it over to Joanne to say a few more words about herself.
Good morning. I'm excited to be here today. That's basically all there is to say, that I own Flower and Myers and Chang along with my husband. And we've been running these businesses for about 20 years, and we have about 440 employees.
Good morning. Glad to be here as well. Michael Tomasi, President and CEO of AccuRounds. We're an advanced manufacturer located in Avon, Mass. We employ 75 people. We do contract precision machining, which means we make shafts, pins, and valves for a variety of industries. We make a shaft that 80% of the world's flu vaccine is manufactured through. We made the top of the Freedom Trail signs, and we make parts for medical defense, robotics, and on, right here in Massachusetts.
Good morning. My name is Mark Ehrlich. I'm actually a carpenter by trade, and for 25 years I was a union officer from 1992 until 2017, the last 12 of which I was the head of the New England Regional Council of Carpenters, a 20,000 member organization covering the 6 states of New England. During that time, I'm also a writer, and I've written 2 books and many articles on labor and politics, and I am now a fellow at the Harvard Labor and Work-Life Program, looking at the issues of payroll fraud, the underground economy, and wage theft, which is a unfortunately chronic problem.
Peter Foreman, South Shore Chamber of Commerce. We're a regional chamber of commerce covering about 25 communities between Cape Cod Canal and Boston along the Route 3 corridor. About 1,300 members, almost all small businesses. And we have currently, in the last couple of years, been heavily involved in a large long-term project looking at the economic competitiveness of the region and how we promote regional economic growth, most recently being involved in the housing issues.
Okay, great. So we're going to basically go through some of the same topics and questions that were discussed in the previous panel. So first, I'd like to start with a question about the tight labor market. So the unemployment rate nationally is at 3.6%. So by that measure, that's one measure showing that labor markets are very tight right now. So I'd like to ask the panelists about the benefits of the labor market being this tight. Are there benefits to an even tighter labor market? And do you see any costs of such tight labor markets? In addition to that, just bouncing off some of the ideas we heard in the last panel, I'm wondering also whether you think labor markets are truly tight. We heard a lot in the previous panel about not just the number of jobs, but the quality of jobs. So I think it would be interesting to hear your thoughts on that, as well as the issue of whether the tight labor markets are really feeding into better wages for workers and also higher prices for consumers potentially. So let's just start with Joanne here.
We are definitely seeing the effect of a tight labor market over the last, I would say, 3 to 4 years. It's been extremely competitive in the restaurant business. In terms of benefits of a tight labor market, I honestly, as an employer, it's hard for me to say that there are a ton of benefits. But if I look from a bigger picture, I think it's great that we are now being encouraged / forced to raise our wages to be competitive. The restaurant business is typically, it's on the minimum wage level of employment for our teams, and it's been very, very challenging. So we have been, over the last 3 or 4 years, we've raised our minimum twice, and we're going to raise it again in the next month or so. So from that perspective, I think it's a great thing that the labor markets are tight. It allows for people to bring more home. But then again, from my perspective, it gets really hard because we have such a hard time finding people. It does make us reconsider whether or not we should keep growing at the pace that we've been growing at.
So I have an article in my office from 1979 that's titled, "Find Me a Few Good Men." And my dad was quoted at the time because he was struggling to find help. So we've been in this for 40 years looking for talent. Unfortunately, in our industry, we're fighting a paradigm of dark, dirty, oily, grungy. And it's the exact opposite of that. It's very well-lit, air-conditioned, computerized equipment, very sophisticated machines. So we're definitely feeling the effects, but we felt it for a long time. And we're starting to turn that with a lot of the outreach that we've done. But a tight labor market as an owner is not the best thing. As a team member, it's good for them. They can command higher wages, but we've always paid above average wages, and we've had to adjust our pay scale similar to Joanne, especially in the lower end. We employ Voc Tech students, co-op kids, and juniors and seniors in high school, and the competitiveness to attract them now is becoming a bidding war. We always paid 50 cents to a dollar above minimum wage for a junior in high school because we never wanted to pay minimum wage. But now they're commanding $2 or $3 above minimum wage. And these are kids that, yeah, have had some training, but they really come on the job to learn. So that's the type of market we're experiencing. So it is impacting our wage scale. And we're addressing that. The challenge we have is our customers want to pay us less, not more. So robotics, there was a comment in the prior panel about robotics replacing jobs. I caution people to rethink that. Robotics will help companies grow and prosper, but they're not going to replace, they're going to recreate jobs, the new jobs 5 and 10 years from now that we don't know what we're going to hire. So those are some of my comments regarding the current tight labor market.
Well, I guess I would start by just looking at the human aspect as opposed to the numbers. There's an old saying that the best social program is a job, and I fully believe that. And I think that to the degree that there is a low unemployment rate in this society, that is unequivocally a good thing, both in terms of economically and in terms of people's sense of self-respect, self-worth, and all the things that go on with having some sense of employment. Having said that, I think that the unemployment figures mask some underlying realities that are going on. One is that there has been a parallel growth in terms of economic development of the underground economy, of people being paid off the books, cash compensation, which obviously is not reflected in the unemployment figures because by its very nature, it's unreported work. And that has the effect of suppressing wages. It is primarily in the immigrant communities and to the degree that people are paying cash and not paying their legal obligations in terms of taxes and insurance. It means that the labor costs are reduced for the employer, and it has therefore the effect of holding down wages for everybody in that particular industry. That's certainly been the case in construction, the industry that I come out of. The second thing has to do with Jenny's questions about, yes, there are jobs. Are they good jobs? Are they jobs with benefits? And all the data shows that certainly from the 80s forward, that with the whole question of the fishing of the economy, that the kinds of jobs that are being created increasingly have fewer benefits. The percentage of people covered by defined pension plans has gone down from something like 35% to 15%, just whether they have health insurance, retirement security, and with the rise of the gig economy, where you're seeing more and more people classified as quote unquote independent contractors as opposed to employees, and therefore not having the benefits of the sort of the legal status of being an employee and the protections, and having to take care of whatever issues around benefits on their own, the obligation falls to them. That means that those jobs, again, I would not characterize particularly as good jobs. So I think we should have a little bit of skepticism and caution about that this is all, nirvana that we've achieved with the low unemployment rate. I mean, it is, again, unequivocally a good thing. And from my perspective, with perhaps the major social public policy issue in the society, the growing income and wealth gap, to the degree that there are tight labor markets, it does allow for people to negotiate for better wages, as both Mike and Joanne have said. And I think to the degree that anything that is out there that is narrowing the income and wealth gap in the society is a very positive and healthy corrective.
So increasingly, I'm hearing from my members their concern about workforce. And I think that roughly equates with a tight labor market, but we're seeing a lot of things that come into the workforce supply more than the aggregate labor numbers. What we're seeing in the suburbs, at least in my area, as much as a tight labor market is an even tighter housing market, and that's creating a workforce challenge where companies are now thinking about where they relocate in order to hopefully attract talent, particularly out of Boston. So they have to be concerned about the commute. This is particularly true in service industries where people are driving longer distance. So a lot of our workforce in service industry is now coming from Rhode Island. Higher skill might be coming from the Boston market, but employers are now increasingly looking at, since people are having trouble with housing, how do they move them into that market? But they're also seeing some other underlying changes in workforce drivers that might help them. I think some of that is training and where they get it. And Mike, I think, will probably be speaking quite a bit about the training gap, but also the changes in ambition and lifestyle choices of younger workers coming along. And I think that's causing some tightening and contraction of available workforce for a lot of employers because they're not quite matching what some of the lifestyle choices may be of potential workers.
Okay, great, thank you. So we talked a little bit just now about how the tight labor markets are impacting, basically forcing companies to pay higher wages, and this will eventually feed into prices and inflation. So one question that we have is, would it matter to your businesses in the long run if inflation were a little bit lower than it is now, say just 0%, so prices are really stable, not growing at all, versus somewhere closer to the Fed's target of 2% versus a higher inflation rate of something like 4%. So we did hear from a previous panelist that at least for some consumers, at low levels of inflation, say 1, 2, or 3%, the difference isn't that big. Is that true for you too? And if it is, at what level of inflation would it really change the way you have to do your business in the long run?
Well, for us, as I said, because we are raising our wages, and similar to what Michael said, at a certain point we will have to raise our prices too. So while we might not be seeing inflation from our vendors to buy our flour or bacon or whatever, we are seeing such strong wage pressure that we are slowly starting to increase our prices. And it's something that I've been watching for the last 3 or 4 years since we've been struggling with this labor market. I feel like, we're fortunate. We have, 8 locations in Boston and Cambridge and a restaurant that are all pretty strong. But I don't know how much longer all of the small businesses, at least from a restaurant perspective, can continue at the price level they're at. I think everybody's starting to see their profit margins get smaller and smaller. We're robust enough that we can carry it for a while, but at a certain point, we too are starting to see it get so small that we have to increase our prices. And I feel like everybody in the restaurant business is holding our collective breath, waiting to see who can last the longest. You know, we just increased our wages a little bit. We're going to do it again. And I feel like my peers we're looking at each other like, how much are you paying a sous chef? How much are you paying a line cook? And everybody's like, I can't believe you can afford that. We all say that to each other, and we're all just crossing our fingers. Somebody's going to go out of business. I mean, not that we want anybody to go out of business, but then that helps with the labor market. We have all of those cooks that we can then entice to come to us. But it's kind of this thing where we're all holding our prices for as long as possible. But I really feel like it's going to just happen where I don't think it's going to be overnight. Everybody's going to double their prices, but it's inevitable. We cannot continue pay. I mean, the minimum wage in Massachusetts is 12, which is amazing, but now everybody wants 15, also amazing. If we were to raise our prices to 15, our wages to 15, our prices would get so high that we wouldn't be able to serve as many people as we do. And so I feel like we play this dance pretty much every time we've been around for about 20 years. So every time the economy gets this way, there's this collective holding of our breath to figure out who can last the longest.
Echo Joanne's comments to a certain extent. I believe in general, low inflation is good. 1-2%, 3 maybe start to get to 4 to 5, then it becomes a concern, right? We have an interesting dynamic in our industry where there is a reshoring manufacturing renaissance taking place. So work is coming back. We don't have the base to support it, but co-location is key. So it's kind of allowing us for the first time in maybe 20 years to look at our pricing structure and pick and choose certain opportunities to increase price, because our customers may not have all the opportunities to move work like they've had in the past because the supply chain has been whittled away, unfortunately, due to some people just leaving the industry because they didn't think it was viable. But I think overall, keeping a 1 or 2% inflation is working from that standpoint, but the dynamics are changing.
Well, putting on, I guess, my hat as someone in the construction industry, all industries are sensitive to interest rate fluctuations. I think construction perhaps almost more than any. Our peaks are larger than most, and our valleys are larger than most. And during the Great Recession of 2007, 2009, it was not a recession in construction, it was a depression. There was 40% unemployment for several years, and a lot of misery that goes along with, entailed with, that high level of extended unemployment. Now, obviously, there's a boom. It's a good thing. And the issue of inflation, I think as long as it stays relatively low, and whether it's a quarter point here, a quarter point there, up or down, I think is not that critical. Obviously, it impacts mortgages and it impacts construction loans. But the underlying drivers of the boom that we're now seeing in construction, I don't think is really based on, it may be, low interest rates may be a necessary but not a sufficient condition, in the sense that the underlying economic development issues in the really strong industries that we have in New England in terms of healthcare and education and finance and hospitality and all the things that are blossoming, that's what's driving, the demand for construction. And I don't think it'll really be impacted that significantly by a quarter point or a half point interest rate fluctuation. If that changes, well, then that will look different, or if the interest rates go up markedly. And I think, as Peter said, the issue of housing, the demand is the demand is there, and it's not a function of the interest rates. And the supply has simply just not kept up with the demand for housing, and it's becoming increasingly unaffordable for just about anybody, but certainly for people in the workforce.
I don't know how close the relationship is now between inflation rates or interest rates and labor supply. I think there's been so much change in the economy and business models and lifestyle choices that some rise in interest rates probably does not ease the labor supply at all, or the workforce supply with most of our businesses on the South Shore economy. I'm not sure, while it would affect mortgage rates, that's not the largest driver in the housing cost. The high housing cost is driven by market more than housing or even land cost. The market demand is just putting that housing out of reach for so many people that a lot of our companies are working for. There might be many industries where the ripple effect of higher interest rates starts squeezing the margin because of supply chain issues on products they're either looking to buy towards their process or what services or products they're selling. But that would be a case-by-case situation, I think.
Okay, so I think we already actually started moving a little bit into the next question about interest rates. So the Fed tries to achieve its dual mandate of maximum sustainable employment and the inflation target of 2%. But the tool that we use is to raise or lower these interest rates. So I'm curious about what your thoughts are on kind of the direct costs and benefits of either higher or lower interest rates on your business, but also thinking about how that might affect the customers that come to your businesses.
I will admit that my grasp of economics in general is not as robust as I wish it were, sitting here in front of everybody talking about interest rates. I really appreciated Jeff's chart because I know that sort of on some level, but seeing it again helps. So when to try to answer this question, low interest rates and how does that affect my business? I mean, I think the way in which I see it affect my business is that when there are low interest rates, it seems that developers all want to build lots of things. And so the more buildings that are out there, the more people want to put bakeries and restaurants in their ground floor. So it's great in that there's a lot of supply. My, freshman class of economics said the higher supply, then the lower the price or something like that. But I haven't seen that. It seems like there's a lot of supply of developers who want to put in bakeries and restaurants. So you would think that then it would be a really competitive market and I could name my price, but I have actually found it to be the opposite. Back in 2007, when the interest rates, I think, were high, or something was going on, and the economy wasn't strong, but I found it really easy to find spaces, and that's when we decided to open both the Second Flower Bakery and Myers and Chang. We got amazing real estate deals. Now, we have opened a bunch more, but every deal since has been increasingly more competitive, less favorable in my favor, and more favorable on the developers' side. And currently, right now, it's the most competitive I've ever seen in that there's tons of spaces, but they're all commanding really, really high prices, which is leading me to feel like maybe we shouldn't expand as quickly as we have in the past because it's starting to get so expensive it doesn't make sense. So I don't really know why that is. I feel like if the interest rates are high or low and everybody's building a lot, then I should be able to find lots of spaces at a decent price. But if it seems like there are so many spaces out there that I'm not sure. I'm not sure why it is. I know there's developers here who might be able to help me answer that question. But it just seems like the prices now that for real estate for me are higher than I've ever seen, which makes it hard for us to consider growing.
So the interest rate environment plays in a couple of areas for me. And on the business side, up until 2013, we were debt free, but we were looking at a possible expansion, not only in facility, but equipment. And obviously having low interest rates helped make that decision and moved us forward as a company. So we had influx of investment there, and that's a positive. We also, as a family, owned some land. And back in 99, we developed a property when rates were low, and we're in a variable rate industrial development bond that was very attractive over 15 years. And we recently completed a building across the street in Woburn. And again, we're able to go to mass development for an industrial development bond. and borrow at very attractive rates. So from an investment standpoint, it's good. And speaking for the handful of employees that are nearing retirement at our company, I don't think they're so enthused with low rates. They'd like to have rates higher. And in talking to some friends that have retired recently and have counted on higher rates, they're not so happy as either. But from a business standpoint and from a team standpoint, wearing two hats as an owner, but also you want to care for your team and have your team have healthy lives and be able to afford houses and cars. Low interest rates play to that advantage for them.
So Mike's point about the those who are either at or close to retirement, certainly a higher interest rate environment helps with savings, and to the degree that my members are part of a defined benefit pension plan, the returns on assets, return on investment tends to be held down by low interest rates environment. And then again, just people's personal savings, the same thing. But again, I said in the larger context, I think that our industry is more resilient and more effective and more likely to continue to grow in a low interest rate environment. And so I'm very supportive of that. I would say one of the other things that happens in the real estate market, which is I think a relatively new phenomenon, is that monetary policy also has an impact on the dollar and the exchange rate. And to the degree that we have a strong dollar, it's also attracting foreign money into real estate is seen as one of the assets that people want to invest in. And so you're seeing Chinese and Russian and Saudi money in Boston, certainly, but in all the major cities all over the country, because that has become a valuable asset. And Joanne, to your point, that's one of the dynamics that continues to drive up prices regardless. But I would say that there's a study that was done by a gentleman who was a former BRA economist who looked at the various component pieces of development costs in both New York City and Boston. And contrary to what everybody says, labor costs have gone through the roof and this and that, it's actually the costs that have increased at a significant factor faster than inflation are land and financing costs. Financing is much more complicated than it used to be, and just simply the cost of putting together a deal is much more expensive. Labor itself, and I'm just talking about labor itself, I'm not talking about the profit margins, which have gone up in this boom, but labor itself and materials have not even gone up as fast as inflation. And I think that's a myth and a misconception that has been very harmful to, I think, the folks who work for a living in the industry. It's not that suddenly construction workers are, the dollars are falling out of their pockets because everything's so good. Yes, it is. Steady employment is a wonderful thing. It still remains the case that even in a boom like this, the average construction worker does not work a 2,000-hour year because of weather, because of churn from one job to another, and 1,500 hours is actually the average. So that while the hourly wage is high, when you multiply that times by the number of hours worked, it's actually not that different from a manufacturing worker salary.
So for a typical small business, and I mean really small business, not the government standard of 500 or fewer employees, but the startup business, the career changer who's given up on the Boston commute, or big corporations and working on their own, starting their own business, maybe a few employees. For most of them, I think access to capital is a lot more important than the cost of capital. Because they're not necessarily looking at large sums of money, nor are they assuming longer periods of time. And so the challenges that a lot of the startup businesses have, I think if they're of some size and looking at a longer term engagement or acquisition of assets, I think banking regulations still have a larger effect on their access to capital than what the interest rate is going to be. I think for a lot of the career changers who are simply looking to do something in their post-retirement career. Uh, it is, I think, finding some other um, options to capital. They may not be looking for a bank loan, uh, but they're looking at how they're going to access that home equity and now 401ks. So that's a mixed bag because if your inflation is going up, your 401k, in some cases you might be getting higher returns, and that may not be so bad. But I think opening up trying to open up as many avenues for access is important for people, whether it's the bank loan or trying to save people from going, as the prior panel touched on, the payday advance companies or whatever you have to do to get those little pockets of cash to get started is a bigger concern than interest rates.
Okay, so I think that's actually a nice segue into the next topic I wanted to touch on, which is so the Fed's dual mandate officially is to have maximum sustainable employment and maintain low and stable inflation. But what do you all think are some other goals that the Fed should try to achieve? And would the Fed be able to achieve these goals using the tools that we have now, which on the monetary policy side are predominantly interest rate tools that allow us to try to control the flow of credit? So I think I did hear a few things mentioned earlier that would potentially um, speak to other goals such as housing availability and things like that. But do you all think there are some other goals that we should look at?
The one goal that I would suggest, which is less based on tools or policy, but I think the gentleman there mentioned it earlier in the other panel, which is educating the public just in general about what the Fed does, what the economy is, what our interest rates. I mean, these questions that I think sometimes we all get in our worlds and we think that everybody knows our language. I think that if you ask the majority of Americans, a lot of people they have pretty basic knowledge of the economy. I mean, maybe you take economics when you're in high school, but you don't have to take it when you're in college if you go to college. And so if you think about what the average person who just goes off into the world and then needs to find a job and pay taxes and find an apartment and pay their bills, but they don't necessarily know all of the things that we're talking about. And I think if people have more education about how the economy works, that might better inform them in terms of decisions they make, which might then better inform the Fed in terms of how to use the tools that they have at their disposal to help the economy. Start with Congress.
I'll second Joanne's comments. I think the outreach and advocacy that the Fed's doing and starting today and has actually done in other areas as well, and specifically workforce development. I know Chris Shannon is here, and they have some efforts to get involved in areas where there's a skills gap. I mean, there's a real serious issue, this silver tsunami, as it's called. There's an aging out of the workforce. In manufacturing over the next 10 years, there's going to be about 3.5 million jobs available, and they expect 2 million to go unfilled. That's a serious issue. So whatever light the Fed could help shed, I'm selfishly promoting advanced manufacturing, but there's some tremendous careers in our industry, not just in the machining end, but the engineering and the quality and the warehousing end. We're to the point now where I've actually connected with Sheriff Tompkins, and I'm going to the jail on Thursday. He's been to my company already, and we're going to see if there's an opportunity for us to link the incarcerated kids that are going through some STEM training to future careers in manufacturing. So if we're able to do this and make it work, we'd like to publicize it so other companies can kind of join on. But we've been very unconventional in our approach to address this unemployment issue, which is not going away in our industry in particular for a long time.
Well, that's a very novel and innovative approach. Good for you. The Fed has done, I think, a really sort of has maintained an even keel in a very volatile economy and incredibly volatile political society that we live in. The Fed's tools, unfortunately, are somewhat limited. You are responsible for monetary policy, but the flip side of that, fiscal policy, is gentleman here said Congress. I mean, we have a dysfunctional federal government in terms of all of the needs that our society has in terms of investing in infrastructure, in terms of dealing with public policy around economic inequality, all those massive issues that are beyond the scope of what the Fed can do. Um, you know, what, and I think in the context of dysfunction, the Fed's role has been actually elevated because you guys have continued to sort of just keep on going and do what needs to be done to sort of stabilize and the economy. But that's until we have some sort of fiscal policy that invests in education and infrastructure and all the things that we need, it's hard to imagine how effective the tools that you have can really be. I would just agree with what everybody else has said from the first panel and from Joanne and Mike about the issue of education, the issue of research. The Color of Wealth study that you did was enormously influential. And I would just encourage you to not only keep that data and that information, that research inside this beautiful building, but to make sure that it gets out into the public and into the civic dialogue, because I think you have a lot of resources and a lot to contribute on both the research and the education fronts.
So I'd reiterate at the national level, anything that can be done at the Fed's end in terms of facilitating capital access and flow with banking regulations is helpful. Certainly the education level to break up this mindset that we all have, particularly it seems down in Washington, that the economy is measured by the stock market and the daily return, and if it's up or down, it's just awful. And the Federal Reserve, I think, plays a big role in that. But locally, what the feds do, I assume the other regional branches do things similar as you do, Eric, but the research and information that you have and that ability to shape issues around regional competitive advantages in terms of building local and regional economies can be very powerful. I think we all tend to get caught up into such macro assessments of what the economy's like or what the future's going to be based on national or sometimes even international trends. And yet, New England is a neighborhood. It's a small subset of a much larger economy, and we have our own competitive advantages, even if we think we're looking a little weaker at times. So the research work that the Fed does and the forums you have and the publications that help shape some of the direction that policymakers, nonprofits, community leaders can work on building a consensus as to where we have strengths and move in that direction, I think are incredibly powerful.
Okay, so before turning it over to the audience for questions in a few minutes, I'd just like to close with a question about how you feel over the past decade the Fed has done at achieving its two goals, and just more in general, the type of environment that's been here for the past decade, how that's been for your businesses and the communities that you operate in. And also, if you'd like to say a few words about challenges that you foresee going forward, or if other closing thoughts you have on the topics that we talked about today.
For the last 10 years, from my perspective, the Fed has been really good. The economy is really strong, and our business is growing, and it's it all seems very, very positive. In terms of challenges, the tight labor market is really hard. And one thing that I failed to mention earlier is that one thing that we're seeing is that we're slowly starting to raise our internal minimum in terms of what we pay dishwashers and line cooks, et cetera. And we've gotten to this point where for what should be really skilled bakers and cooks, we're paying a competitive wage, and then but we are getting people who are not trained. but we need them. We need anybody. And so what we're seeing is that we used to, pay a pretty good wage for an opening baker position, and we took only skilled bakers because it's a really important part of running the bakery. And now we'll basically take anybody who expresses interest in maybe coming to work at the bakery. And so we see a lower productivity, like the amount that I can expect somebody who's just walking in off the street who wants to bake is 60% of what I can expect from somebody who's been trained. And so having the labor market be so tight for us has resulted in, unfortunately, lower expectations of what we can get from our teams, which then results in lower productivity in terms of what we can offer to our guests.
Again, I'll agree with Joanne. I think the Fed's done a great job the last 10 years with the economy in general. Our biggest challenge is labor. And the tighter the labor the market is, the more challenging it is. And we've experienced similar scenarios that Joanne's describing as well with wages and attracting talent. Soft skills, we talk about technical skills, skills gap, but soft skills is a big part of that. We have core values at Accurons: gratitude, excellence, team first, initiative, and trust. And at the end of the day, if you have those 5 things, or at least understand how to behave, we'll train you. We'll give you the technical skill. And we're challenged on just the soft skill front. A final comment in general, and I'm not sure if this is an area the Fed can help tackle or not, but we talk about business. And unfortunately, when people hear the word business, they think of the mega corporations with $1 billion in the bank, and why can't they treat their employees better? Well, I think in the state, don't quote me on this, but I'm pretty accurate that 70% or so of companies in Massachusetts are 100 employees or less, or 90%, and 70 or 20 or less, something like that. We're struggling to make payroll every week, right? We're paying off debt. We have to pay fair above fair. We have to give incredible benefits. We have a garden on site at our facility. We have a fitness center. We put solar on the roof. We're trying to differentiate ourselves and become an employer of choice to attract the millennials and have that corporate responsibility. But that comes at a cost. And if our customers aren't willing to pay us more, we've got to drive that through efficiency. And we need talent to do that. So if there's some way that the Fed can look at business and not only just generalize it, but talk about small business in a bit of a different light, and we're willing to come to the table and roll up our sleeves and do all this work to help the general public and awareness and employment and whatnot. But when it comes to money and contributions, which a lot of people look for, we can't do that. But we can give you some sweat equity into that and make that differentiation where we need the big companies leading the charge, but you need the small businesses engaged as well.
In response to your question, I guess I'd repeat what I said before, which is I think the Fed since in the wake of the recession has had this kind of slow but steady approach to the economy that's been very stabilizing, again, in the context of a pretty unstable, larger political dynamic that we have in our country which has been, in some ways, I think the role of the Fed has been to unite, whereas the sort of political culture is to divide. And, but again, I'll just repeat what I said before, but your tools are limited to monetary policy. And so the real challenge, I think, in the larger society is how we're going to sort of move forward in a way that we need to meet all the challenges that we're facing going forward. One of the advantages I would say about the tight labor market, and this speaks to, again, both Mike and Joanne, I think from a slightly different perspective, is that in the construction industry, it has allowed for a significant transformation of diversity in the workforce. To the degree that, I mean, that's been a conscious choice by the industry, by the unions, by the employers, recognizing that historically was a problem in construction. And I haven't seen anything change so dramatically in my lifetime as the level of diversity in construction. And that's been made possible by the fact that there's this tight labor market, and there's opportunities for people, and there's opportunity for jobs, and these are good jobs. And it's interesting, whenever the Carpenters Union, we used to open our doors for our periodic orientations for people who want to consider apprenticeship, we never had a problem finding people. I mean, it didn't look like a tight labor market to us because the opportunity to sort of have a life-altering career was so attractive that some of the people who might otherwise have gone to flower uh, decide. Sorry, Joanne. Decided to go into construction, and many women of color. I mean, it's been really exciting to see that. So there are all sorts of ancillary benefits, I think, that come along with a tight labor market that that might not be immediately obvious.
I will say that we do lose people to the construction industry. We do. We really do.
So it's been a good 10-year run. To the extent the Federal Reserve can take some credit for that and point to it, I think you've done a great job. I do wonder about uh, what will happen in the future at some point. I don't think it's 2020 when the economy collapses or starts to contract, but at some point it's going to turn. Uh, and I think the bigger question is the one you started asking yourself or with this session at the beginning when you framed it is, are you going to have enough of a toolkit in the future to stimulate a downturn? Um, you're going to be able to answer that much better than I think any of us on the panel can. Um, and so that would get us to where you are in the present and perceptions. And from the outside, um, as a keener observer of politics and the economy, it looks to me like the Fed has gotten a little timid and a little defensive in responding to national attacks and criticism. And I wonder if that has undermined a little bit of your role in providing that continuity and stability removed from the political climate. And is the Fed as guilty as our national policymakers and local policymakers in wanting to keep the 10-year run, continuing it at whatever cost, and not looking ahead to how you're going to get us out of an eventual dip?
Okay, great. So I think these were a lot of good points, and hopefully will stimulate some conversation from the audience right now. Anyone who wants to ask a question of the panel members or give some thoughts on some of the topics we touched on today?
Thank you. Renee Harkeen, Single Point Partners. We're a wealth management firm. The last time that I saw the wage inflation numbers, I think they were running around low to mid threes. I think if you go back to the boom of the 90s, maybe even the expansion after 9/11, after '02, I think they were running probably in the mid fours as kind of a normal, right? And so for the business operators here, two questions. One, are you seeing levels of staff turnover consistent with what you saw in those expansionary times in the late 90s and the early noughts? And if so, would it be fair to say that we're probably, or I should say, if you're not seeing it, is it fair to say that there's probably a lot more runway ahead? Even though, we describe the labor market as tight, it's all relative, right? And so at 3.2% wage inflation, is that really tight, or is there more room here to run before you start seeing significant staff turnover and bringing in new untrained people and so forth?
I mean, we see a lot of staff turnover. We always have, I think, just the nature of the restaurant business. People come and they go. Most people aren't planning it to be their career. So our challenge is always to take people who come to us planning to work part-time, short-term, and try to groom them and train them to make it into their industry. I think for us, we struggle with staff leaving nowadays because there are so many opportunities for them where they can make, the same wage. And we see people going into construction. I have the gig economy. I have staff that leave because they want to drive for Uber. Um, I have bakers who leave because they can go to Encore and make twice what we can pay them. So we're definitely seeing a lot of staff turnover that is making it really challenging for us.
We've been pretty fortunate. Our turnover over the years has not been high. We're about 4% or so. Probably a little better now, actually, than 10 or 20 years ago. Um, from a business standpoint, we have more opportunity today than we've ever had. We have more people coming to us looking to place work than we've ever had. We can't take advantage of it because we don't have the people to do it. And I'll tell you, as a business owner, there's nothing more troubling or frustrating than that. So we continue to look at technology, not to replace people. I will never replace a person with a robot or automation, but we're getting impacted by not only those two things, machine learning, machine monitoring, 3D printing, big data. Someone mentioned about the jobs of the future. We may have to hire a data analyst, which never in a million years I thought we'd be looking for. So the runway for us seems pretty long because we're entering LTAs, 5 and 7 year LTAs for aerospace work. That's unheard of in our industry. Correct. Growing and replacing our retiring technical talent.
Hi, Kevin Bielmeyer, Connecticut Economic Resource Center. This isn't really a question, it's really more of just a comment. I want to applaud the Federal Reserve for having a forum on small business and entrepreneurism because, as was pointed out in one of the statistics, the country's business is built on the backs of small business, and it is vitally important. And I think when we look at the macro picture, as the Federal Reserve, rightfully does, very often the loudest voices are the larger corporations in terms of perhaps making policy and setting policy, and they have a voice in the room, I'm sure. And arguably, the louder voice or the most focused voice should be on the small businesses.
Great. Anyone else? Don't be shy. As you see, you don't have to have a question. You can just give a comment as well. So.
Hi, Tom Phillips again. I was wondering, any of you concerned about the trade war with China, either directly or indirectly? And by directly, I mean, obviously, if you're importing. And I just heard China's going to slap 60 billion. We call them tariffs. I guess they call it taxes, right? That's what they keep saying. They're not tariffs, they're taxes. But wondering if you're concerned about that, either because your employees are going to have to pay more for products that they, wouldn't otherwise have to, and they may delay now buying things, or if there's a direct impact on trade in terms of any kind of import-export issues.
It has a direct impact on us because we buy material overseas. So we're paying a tariff. We're passing that. We're just passing that through. We can't absorb that. I think the concern is the uncertainty, right, of where this is going to end up. There is talk in our company about, the China and the trade issues and tariffs and how does that impact us as a company. And, right now we're passing the price increase on. Where it goes from there, I don't know. But there is definitely concern about where it may end up.
I'd be less concerned about trade policy with one country. I'd be a little more concerned about trade policy generally, and if you get into a broad-based trade war of some type. But with China in particular, I think there's probably more concern about intellectual property and security and technology theft than that we ought to be paying attention to than simply the tariffs and trade directly between the two countries. But I would like to see more freer trade generally than some of the discussion we've had the last year or so.
So yes, we have time for one more.
Our country.
So the
Let me
question,
repeat that. Are any of you being impacted by the issues over immigration from the South?
We are
Central
directly impacted by the immigration, the climate around immigration. I have prep cooks and bread shapers and bread mixers who have been detained, who have been sent back, who have then come back. And I have teams of people who are just nervous. Sometimes they don't come to work because they hear something's going to happen. We've trained all the managers on what to do if somebody comes in from ICE and how to deal with that. So it's something that, our staff is probably 30% Latino, 40% maybe. So it's definitely impacting
It's
us.
not contributing to productivity.
Is it contributing to product?
No, I mean, it's the things you have to do are not contributing to. We've got to train people what to do if ICE walks in.
Oh, correct.
That's what I mean.
Correct, yes.
It's a huge issue in construction. If you look at the data, if you basically south of the Mason-Dixon line, the construction industry workforce is immigrant, period. About maybe 60, somewhere, depending on the state, somewhere between 60 and 80%, and half of that is undocumented. So I have always scratched my head wondering all these people who are looking to build walls and eliminate borders about how they're planning on getting work done, because it's a lot of the same people who are presumably industry leaders. But when I opened my remarks about the question of the tight labor market, and I said that there's some things that aren't getting measured, that's one of them. Because a lot of that is the underground economy. A lot of it is cash compensation. It's unreported, so it's not documented in statistics that the Fed or any other governmental agency deals with. And it has a significant impact on suppressing wages. If you just look over the recent history of immigration in the last 20, 30 years in various meatpacking and various industries that have had a huge influx of immigrant workers, it has been associated with a very significant decline in wages, and it has added to the dynamic of income inequality in this country. So, I wish there was a rational policy around that too, just like I wish it were around a whole lot of things that we don't seem to be very rational about these days.
okay, great. So I'd like to thank our panelists for a wonderful discussion. I think they all deserve a round of applause.